And welcome to the Women's International Forum's January event, the first event of 2020. I don't think I need to introduce myself any longer but because we've been doing this for 2 years on Zoom, and I think everyone knows me, and I think in our participants list it's all with members. I'm sorry if I can't acknowledge everyone by name, but on behalf of the executive committee of the Women's International Forum, we would like to wish you all a very happy and a healthy 2022. Our topic today is designing babies, how technology is changing the ways we create children. And our speaker is Dr. Robert Klitzman of Columbia University. Thank you so much, Dr. Klitzman, for joining us. In fact, the topic is also the title of the book that he wrote. In a few moments, I'll call upon my colleague Tina Kunjul, who is from Mauritius and who is our vice president, one of our vice presidents, to introduce Dr. Klitzman. But before that, I want to take this opportunity to introduce a new member of our executive board who is here with us, Monique Jackman from Barbados. Welcome to the board. Monique herself was a diplomat representing Guyana. And then she gave up her job, her profession, to follow her husband on his diplomatic posting. So we are very happy to have Monique join us. I will now give the floor to Tina to introduce Robert. Tina.
Thank you, Zarina. Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year and a warm welcome to today's event. Dr. Klitzman, MD, attended Princeton University and Yale Medical School. He completed his internship and psychiatric residency at what is now New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. Currently, Dr. Klitzman is professor of psychiatry at the College of Physicians and Surgeons and the Joseph Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. He co-founded and for 5 years co-directed the Columbia University Center for Bioethics, and he is the director of Columbia's online and in-person bioethics master's and certificate programs. He has written over 150 scientific journal articles, numerous chapters for books, and 9 books on critical issues in bioethics, including genetics, the ethics of assisted reproductive technology, stem cell, recreational drug use, HIV prevention, research ethics, doctor-patient relationships, etc., and is considered an authority on these topics, as well as genetic testing for Huntington's disease and breast cancer, genetic discrimination, mad cow disease, HIV and AIDS pandemics, and the ethics for a post-COVID world, just to name a few topics that Dr. Klitzman has expertise in. Dr. Klitzman has received numerous awards for his work, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Commonwealth Fund, the Aaron Diamond Foundation, the Hastings Center, and the Rockefeller Foundation. He is a member of the Empire State Stem Cell Commission, the Ethics Working Group of the HIV Prevention Trials Network, and has served on the US Department of Defense's Research Ethics Advisory Panel. He is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a regular contributor to the New York Times and CNN. His books include The Ethics Police, The Struggle to Make Human Research Safe, Am I, My Genes, Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing, Designing Babies, How Technology is Changing the Ways we have children, our topic for today. When Doctors Become Patients, A Year-Long Night, Tales of a Medical Internship, In a House of Dreams and Glass, Becoming a Psychiatrist, Being Positive, The Lives of Men and Women with HIV, The Trembling Mountain, A Personal Account of Kuru, Cannibals and Mad Cow Disease, and Mortal Secrets, Truth and Lies in the Age of AIDS. Dr. Klitzman, it's a pleasure to have you with us again. A warm welcome to the Women's International Forum. Zarina, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Tina, for that wonderful and extensive introduction of Robert. I'd like to now give the floor to Robert. He will speak, and then after that, we'll take questions.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be able to speak with you again and be here again. And thank you, Serena, and thank you, Tina, for that wonderful introduction. You didn't have to read the whole thing, but but thank you. I really see this as an interactive session, so please feel free to ask questions, and we'll try to leave enough time to have a good Q&A period. And I think, I don't know if Serena, if I can show my slides. I think you may need to make me a co-host to share my screen.
Yes, we can make you a co-host.
Or
I'm
whatever
going
works.
to ask someone from the embassy to make you a
Okay,
yes, you have been made co-host.
Okay, great, thank you. So, okay. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Move that over, okay, hold on. And a second. Okay. So I'm talking about designing babies, how technology is changing the ways we create children, which is the title of a book I published just sort of a month or two before COVID started. These are issues that affect all of us, no matter what country we're in, because 10% of all men and women throughout the world are infertile. So 10% of men, 10% of women, which means that 20% of couples can't have kids if they want to have kids. This is a widespread global problem. And of course, infertility is something, as I'll talk about, that comes up in many cultures historically and has been the topic of stories and myths from the Bible on, etc. And there are also, in addition to 20% of people not being able to have children if they want to have children, there are also single parents by choice. There are women who, and men, who haven't found sort of the partner they want to raise children with and decide, hey, I want to have a child on my own. And so they'll arrange through assisted reproductive technologies, often IVF, to have children on their own. There are also fertile women who are delaying childbirth. So there are women who, when they were 32, were fertile. They would not have biological problems getting pregnant, but they decide they want to first pursue a career, pursue their education. Now they're 38, 39, 40, 41, and they now want to have kids, and it's much harder biologically. So they too seek treatment. There are also gay and lesbian individuals and couples who want to have children, and so they too use IVF. To give an example, at this point, 7% of all births in Denmark, should be percent there, are use assisted reproductive technologies. And the number, this is from a few years ago, the number is rapidly rising really throughout the world, and not just in the developed world, but in emerging countries as well. And so there are a number of questions. What are the legal, ethical, social, cultural questions that come up because of assisted reproductive technologies? How do providers and patients and policymakers, insurance companies and others look at these issues, and what factors are involved? And what I found when I got interested in this is little research was involved. And I should say it was done. I should say how I got involved in this. One reason was that a friend of mine from college a few years ago said, hey, would you like to be a sperm donor? I want to have a child. She hadn't found the man she wanted to marry. All you have to do is give me your sperm. I'll take care of everything. I'll raise a child. I don't really want you involved in raising the child. Is that okay? And I thought, well, that's an interesting proposition. And I ultimately said no, but it forced me to think about the issues. And similarly, a few years ago, I wrote another book, as mentioned, called Am I My Genes? Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing. And when I did the research for that book, I interviewed people who are at risk of Huntington's disease, which is a terrible neurological and psychiatric disease. If you have the gene for it, there's a 50% chance that each of your children will have the gene. And if you have the gene, you will die of it, usually in your 40s or 50s, if you don't die of something else first. So when I asked patients who have this disease, what are the biggest issues you face? And again, what they said was, well, the biggest issue I face is whether I have kids. Should I get married? Should I not get married? Should I go live in Tahiti by myself and be an artist? because I'm afraid of passing on this mutation. Yet I can also do screen embryos. I can abort fetuses. I can test fetuses, and if they have the mutation, abort them. So what should I do? And I thought this raised a lot of important, interesting questions. And what people would say is, if I abort a fetus that has the mutation that I have, or if I screen out an embryo before it's implanted into the womb, and that embryo has the mutation I have, what am I saying about the value of my own life? Because I would have been aborted. I would have been screened out. And yet here I am. Yes, I will die of this disease when I'm 40 or 50, but I've led a pretty good life. But I don't know if I want to bring a child into the world who has this disease. So again, these are very difficult psychological, as mentioned, I'm trained as a psychiatrist, as well as ethical, social issues. The past literature showed that many women find infertility treatments difficult. They often feel isolated. There have been debates about whether to regulate this area more, if so, how. Of course, the United States at the moment, and in some other countries, there are strong pro-life advocates who feel that we should not be doing things with the embryo. We should just leave embryos as they are. And so there are a number of questions, how people look at this use of, as I'll talk about, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And that is when, just as background, when sperm meets egg, they form an embryo that's one cell and then divides to 2 cells and 4 cells and 8 and 16 and 32, and eventually becomes each of us. Well, when it's still in the petri dish or through IVF, and it's say 8 cells or 16 cells, you can remove 1 or 2 cells and you can do genetic testing. And you can say, here is, let's say a couple makes 8 embryos. You could say these 4 will be boys, these 4 will be girls. Which do you want? These 4 for women who have the breast cancer mutation. These 2 have the breast cancer mutation. These others don't. These have this other mutation. These may have genes associated with intelligence, slightly higher intelligence. Which embryos do you want to choose? So this process is called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Before the embryo is implanted into the womb through IVF, we can do genetic testing and decide which embryos we want to use. And again, this verges on questions of eugenics that have been major moral problems. And of course, in Nazi Germany led to horrific results where there was a feeling we want to make the genes of a particular country better. Eugenics started in the United States, as I'll talk about, where there was a desire to have pure white Anglo-Saxon Protestant populations as waves of immigrants came from other countries. And of course, fears of immigrants continue, desires to make our countries or any country's gene pool pure, whatever that may mean, are still there. So these are all issues serving as a background. And of course, fertility goes back, as I mentioned, in all cultures, given that 20% of people throughout history of couples have had difficulties becoming pregnant. Issues of pregnancy, images of pregnancy, of maternity, of motherhood, cut across all cultures. We wouldn't be here as a species if there wasn't a strong desire to get pregnant, have children. Of course, even in the Bible, Abraham had difficulty conceiving with Sarah. There are a number of issues in the Bible about women having difficulty having children, etc. There's the Annunciation, way in which Mary became pregnant with Jesus. Again, these issues of pregnancy and childbirth, of motherhood, go back in all cultures throughout times and continue to be important. But these issues took a turn about 41 years ago when the first test tube baby was born. This is Louise Brown. She was born 41 years ago. This is her today. Actually, this is her right before the pandemic. This is her 2 years ago. And she's perfectly fine. People at the time, if you may remember, those of you who are over 40 may remember there were big debates about test tube babies. Should we allow this or not? There was a lot of concern, but it since obviously has grown. But there have been problems. This is so-called Octomom, a woman, Natalie Suleiman in California, who gave birth to octuplets a few years ago. She was on public assistance, and through IVF, 8 embryos were implanted, or at least 8 led to children. There were concerns, was this sort of an abuse of the system? In other words, here's this technology, and with many technologies, it can lead to good uses or it could lead to problematic uses. And of course, even deciding what's good, what's bad raises question. This is a 74-year-old woman who gave birth to twins in India a few years ago in 2019. The next day, her husband had a stroke, was entered in the hospital. I don't think he ever left. But again, women, their womb can still support a fetus, even if the quality of their eggs goes down. So this woman was able to give birth by having an egg donor, another woman's egg was used, but she was able to give birth. And again, there are questions, how old is too old? If we have this technology, should we let 74-year-old women, 74-year-old men use it, knowing that when the child's 10 years old, the child may not have a mother or father? Again, these are big issues. And this is just showing when the embryo is, you see 4 cells here, when it's about 8, 16 cells, we can remove one or more cells, that's a cell there, and diagnose it genetically. And the other reason these issues are coming to the fore is that the cost of doing genetic testing has dropped dramatically. So in 2001, 21 years ago, was the first time that the human genome was sequenced. And as background, we have our DNA, our genome consists of about 3 billion letters. It's 4 chemicals that we abbreviate ACTG, and they're in a unique combination, a word sort of 3 billion letters long of just those 4 letters. And each of us has a slightly different 3 billion letter word. That's our DNA. We're 99.9% the same, but we differ by 0.1%, and that's what gives us our different hair color, or eye color, or height, skin color, predispositions to certain diseases, whether we have a predisposition to breast cancer or to Huntington's disease or various other diseases, et cetera. And the cost of sequencing the whole genome was actually $1 billion when it was first done. It went down to 100 million to 10 million to 1 million to 1,000, and of course now it's as you'll see here, it's just it's less than $1,000. It's a few $100s, and of course there's companies like 23andMe that allow people to do their own genetic testing on themselves, or to do it without going through a doctor and then send it to a lab. So because of that, we are able to genetically test embryos and fetuses for many, many more things, which is part of the issue. These issues came to a head a few years ago when Dr. He Jiankui from China used technology called CRISPR to genetically edit a baby. So in other words, it's one thing to say, I've made these 8 embryos and these 4 will be girls and these 4 will be boys, and I want to use just the boys or the girls or the ones without the breast cancer gene or whatever. It's another thing to go into the embryo and actually change what's in there. Say, I want to add some IQ genes that'll give me more IQ, or give the child more IQ points, or I want to take out some genes or add in some other genes. And this is a larger issue that has raised a lot of concerns. And He Jiankui did this, apparently produced several babies whose genes he had actually altered. So this will alter the genes of those children and those children's children, those children's children's children, et cetera. And so this obviously raises another set of issues. As I mentioned, eugenics, which is a concern that is, if you start mucking around with Mother Nature and genes, it could be good or it could be bad. So on the one hand, we can get rid of bad diseases, which many of us feel is legitimate. On the other hand, there's concern about are wealthy people going to be able to afford to add IQ points? And already, it's complicated, but already a disease like breast cancer, which is right now, unfortunately, affects many people, both wealthy and poor, in the United States and some other countries, is becoming increasingly a disease of the poor, because wealthy people are now able to screen out the embryos that have breast cancer genes, and whereas poor people can't afford to do that. And of course, that raises many concerns about justice and equity. If the disease becomes more one of poor people, will there be less money invested in finding cures or treatment? Again, these are social issues. And as I mentioned, eugenics in the United States has played, unfortunately, a role. This is in the 1920s. Here's a eugenics building at the Kansas Free Fair. And those of you may know that in the United States, there are county fairs often, that still are, which there'll be prizes for the best pumpkin, the biggest apple, the biggest squash, the best pig, the biggest cow, and now they also gave awards for the best pedigree. And this was as waves of immigrants started to come in the 1920s from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe. There were concerns that we were, going to make the American gene pool impure, and there was pushback. So again, these are major concerns that are still with us. And of course, designing babies and changing babies is also the stuff of science fiction. Build a Baby, The Handmaid's Tale, for instance, many of you know, was a novel by Margaret Atwood, then was made into a movie and then a TV miniseries in which there were women who the infertility went down among wealthy women, and so other women were used to sort of produce babies for wealthy men. So there's a lot of issues here about the ways that these technologies may get used or fears of their getting used. And I think the challenge is there's potential misuse, but the challenge is to see, are there ways these technologies could be used for good? As I said, these technologies are being used to help many infertile people. 20% of couples who can't otherwise have a child are not now able to have a child because of these technologies. We're able to screen out genes for terrible diseases, but we want to make sure it's a way that's equitable, that doesn't disproportionately benefit only the wealthy, etc. Again, Never Let Me Go is another novel and then film about a future society in which people are bred to be organ donors for other people who need organs. So I did a study interviewing lots of doctors and patients who are involved in this space, and I found that there's a series of dilemmas that doctors and patients face about choosing medication, IVF, choosing eggs, choosing sperm, choosing embryos, choosing womb. At this point in the United States and in many, many countries, and I should say that IVF clinics exist, as far as I know, in basically every country in the world. Infertility exists all over the world. There are major IVF clinics in, many, many, many emerging countries as well. And there's a whole roster of choices. So in some ways, we've made reproduction a commercial enterprise in some ways. And that could be good, as I said, but also has potential misuses we need to be careful of. There's a series of stresses. There are medical stresses, social, psychological, economic stresses. As I mentioned, the costs remain high. Insurance coverage in most countries is limited. This varies, of course. So in Israel, there is a relatively high amount of coverage. In a number of Western European countries that have national health care systems, there is a reasonable amount of coverage, but not enough always. IVF works about 25% of the time, and that goes down with age. So if you're 30 and you're undergoing IVF, your chances of success are higher. If you're 40 and undergoing IVF, it's going to be much, much harder. And many of you, I'm sure, know people, may have personal experience with this or have friends or family members who've undergone this and know it can be very difficult and could be costly. So even in the United States now, and in a number of Columbia University, for instance, has said, okay, for our employees, we'll cover IVF, we'll cover, say, one round of IVF. But if one round only works 25% of time, and I should say one round in the United States costs around $25,000. So it's still quite a bit of money. But if one round fails, as it will in 75% of cases, what then? And again, it can be expensive, and I'll talk about some of the challenges. I was struck in doing the interviews how painful it was to be infertile, where people said, women who were in their young 30s would say, look, I'm not part of the parents club. All my friends are having kids and they're talking baby talk and doing play dates, and I can't get pregnant. And friends of mine say, well, I guess you and your husband are too concerned with your careers. You don't want to have kids. And the answer is, well, we desperately want to have kids, but we can't. And there's a lot of taboo in talking about this. So a lot of men, 50% of infertility is due to male biological problems, 50% due to female problems. But men often don't want to deal with this. They say, well, I'm macho. I don't have, I'm nothing wrong with my sperm. And of course, just even to say someone's impotent is how we describe people with men who have sexual difficulties. But impotent, who wants to be impotent? Impotent means you're powerless. It's sort of this broader term that has all kinds of metaphorical associations. I was struck that miscarriage is seen as a death. Some of you may know this, but as a man, I've never had a miscarriage. So, but women say, you know, I had a miscarriage and it's like a member of my family died. I mean, I had hopes and dreams, and I bought a crib and decorated a baby's room, and now it feels like a death. And my friends are people don't understand that. You know, here I am, people say, well, it's just a miscarriage. It's not even a person. Get over it. You know, not that I think that a fetus is a person, but it still feels like a death. So again, these are very difficult psychological issues, and people don't understand. And I should add, there's a need for often psychotherapy can often help, etc. Adoption is one option if you're infertile, but it's become harder, as many of you know. The availability of abortion has decreased the number of unwanted infants in a number of countries. 20, 30 years ago, there were adoptions from a number of other countries. People from the United States adopted babies from China or Guatemala or Russia for various reasons. That's become less available. A lot of countries feel, understandably, why are we exporting our babies to other countries? You know, we can find homes for them here, et cetera, et cetera. So, so that's not as much an option, though some people still pursue it. Many, as I said, heterosexual couples also delay, both in the United States and elsewhere, delay getting treatment. They wait years. So women often who, as I mentioned, could have had kids in their young 30s wait, but also once there are problems, there are taboos about sex, taboos talking about sex. People don't want to talk about it. Men particularly say, well, that, you know, even if it's thought to be, well, the man may have a low sperm count. A lot of men say, you know, I'm not dealing with this. This is your problem. You know, childbirth equals, you know, those are women's issues, not men's issues, even though obviously it takes two to make a child. There's a lot of marital tensions that can occur. Some people don't know or think about infertility treatment often enough. There are medications you can try that help many people, but if side effects are not always successful. There is IVF, in vitro fertilization, which, as I said, is when we remove an egg from a woman, remove sperm from a man, and then in a petri dish basically fertilize them. But as I mentioned, a lot of women are born with all the eggs they will ever have in their life. And as they age, the eggs age and don't become as viable. So women who are closer to 40 have increased risks of having kids with Down syndrome because there'll be the DNA in the egg sort of erodes. Yet many women, of course, understandably prefer to use their own eggs rather than use another woman's eggs. They fear that the child will be less theirs if they have someone else's egg. And I'll talk about in the United States, there's a big business in buying and selling human eggs. And people come from all over the world here to buy eggs. That's raised a whole set of issues. Sometimes people ask their sister, and then there are issues, well, if it's going to be my egg that you're going to raise as a child, that's fine. But then I want to say it's my biological child. And am I going to be the aunt or am I going to be a co-mother? What does that mean? How old is too old? Often women will say, well, I'm 40, but I still want to try using my own eggs, even though there's only a 1% chance of success. People say, yes, but I'm healthy, I exercise, I have the money to keep paying for IVF after IVF, and people will spend, you know, $100,000, $150,000 trying to get pregnant. Some people can afford that, some can't. Some doctors say, look, this is ridiculous, I'm not going to help you. Other doctors will say, sure, if you want to keep paying me, I'll keep taking the money. And so again, ethical issues come up. How old is too old? There are no real guidance on that. What about the father being too old? Also questions if there's, as I mentioned, there's not going to be a parent when the child's 5 or 10 years old. When is enough enough? Who decides when it's time to say, no, this is no longer working, or certainly that you should not use your own eggs, for instance? So there are egg agencies using strangers' eggs that have mushroomed in the United States. There are drop-down menus, as I'll show. Let me just quickly advance here. So this is one website. This is the eggdonor.com. You can choose Caucasian egg donors, Chinese, Hispanic, Japanese, Korean, etc. At the bottom, you can choose Jewish egg donors, Islamic egg donors. Here's another one with drop-down menus. You can choose the race, the height, the weight, the skin, the eyes, the hair, etc. Here's another one that looks like lots of makeup. It looks almost like a, these are the blondes. You can scroll down and see the brunettes, et cetera. So this gets into questionable territory in a way. What's being sold? What if someone said, the prices of eggs in the US goes up with the students' SAT scores, the scholastic aptitude tests that one takes to go to college. So if you want, there are people who say, though, I want a Harvard egg, I'm willing to pay $50,000, $100,000 for a Harvard egg, one of the people I interviewed said. There are questions about informed consent. This is unregulated. Anyone on this call could open up an egg agency in the United States tomorrow. There are risks. Women who are going to donate eggs, the companies go after 18 to 20-year-old women because those are women whose eggs are the best quality, but they need to be injected with high levels of hormones. There's a risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome that can cause side effects, including death. Many young women think they're going to earn money and they undergo genetic testing as part of this because the agency wants to say, well, they don't have genes for breast cancer, other diseases. And these young women think they're going to earn $50,000. Instead, they're told, oh, no, you have the gene for breast cancer. So we're going to reject you. And guess what? You have this risk of disease and good luck. The other problem is most couples never tell the child that there were donor eggs or donor sperm used. So the child thinks that their genetic parent is their mother or father. And yet what's happening is as adults, once they're 18, people will contact 23andMe and submit a saliva sample and learn that they have 150 half siblings around the world or 50 half siblings, that their person they thought was their genetic mother or father is not their genetic mother or father. And again, parents should tell their child, gee, a nice lady helped us create you, or a nice man. However, parents are afraid of doing that. They're afraid their child will love them less. Ironically, if you don't tell and the child then finds out, the child may feel betrayed. How come you never told me that, you're not really my genetic father? So again, a lot of questions. The prices of eggs in the United States, there were concerns about so-called commodification. We don't believe in selling people. We call it slavery. So should we be selling eggs? So the American Society for Reproductive Medicine at first said, okay, it's okay to sell eggs, but you can't pay more than $10,000. And there was a lawsuit. There was a Japanese-American couple who wanted to buy an egg from a Japanese-American woman. She wanted $50,000. They were willing to pay that. And they went to court and said that ASRM was involved in price fixing. And so they're no longer, and they won, or was settled. So they're no longer price caps. So people could charge as much as they want for an Ivy League, gifted athlete. I want a Harvard graduate who is, 6'2" and blonde hair and blue eyes and, A+ average or whatever it is. There's also issues increasing with freezing eggs. So a number of companies like Google and Facebook and Apple want to keep their young employees who are female, who are, say, in their late 20s or early 30s. Those women may be concerned, gee, I want to have a child. I don't want to wait till I'm 40 because my eggs aren't as good. So Facebook and Google are saying, well, we'll pay the cost of freezing your eggs. And a lot of people are doing this. It's become a big business. The problem is, though, we don't know the quality of the eggs after 5 or 6 years. So it's only been going on 5, 6, 7 years. So we don't know in 10 years, are the eggs still good? There have been times when there have been blackouts or the freezer breaks, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of eggs that are then destroyed, and young women who thought, gee, I don't have to worry about this. Now I have a guarantee. There are then problems. Most eggs aren't used, et cetera. So it's not a guarantee. Sperm banks also, there are, again, potential benefits. Many, as 10% of men are infertile, but there are challenges. It's unregulated. It's mostly anonymous. There are ASRM, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, which are the IVF doctors, say, well, there should be a limit on the number of children created by a single donor. If I'm a single donor, I shouldn't create too many kids. But this basically isn't followed. There's a man in Britain who's fathered close to 1,000 children. He's very proud of that. I think it was up to 950 recently, and he wants to get it to 1,000. So et cetera. And again, which sperm to buy. One of the women I interviewed said, well, I went for IQ. So I got a sperm donor who was from an Ivy League school, perfect math scores, was a math major, and I have a kid who is out on the spectrum with Asperger's syndrome. So again, it's hard to predict these things. There's an old story that when there was a famous Spanish actress who contacted George Bernard Shaw in the beginning of the 20th century and said, gee, Mr. Shaw, imagine if we got married, our kids would have my looks and your brains. And Shaw wrote back and said, yes, but imagine if they have my looks and your brains. So people may think they're buying certain genes, but of course, there's a lot of unpredictability. There's no guarantee if you choose a bright 6'2", blonde hair, blue-eyed egg or sperm donor that is going to be what your child's going to be. So choosing embryos, as I mentioned, we can eliminate certain diseases, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's, breast cancer, but genes manifest themselves differently. Doctors often don't understand these issues, interests as well. Again, this can help get rid of certain diseases, but genetics, genes vary. Sometimes it's more than one gene. There are questions, what diseases, what genes should we screen out? For instance, if there are genes for Alzheimer's, that won't affect the child till the child's 50, should we say, no, I don't want a child with Alzheimer's, who's eventually going to get Alzheimer's? So again, there are questions who should decide right now in the United States. Anything goes. In the United Kingdom, there is a set list that gets expanded of which diseases can be screened for. And again, countries, and of course, you're from all over the world, countries vary in whether they regulate this at all. If so, how they regulate it. Do they let any kind of PGD be used? Some say no, some say yes. Some say, well, we'll only cover for certain major diseases. If you want to pay out of pocket, you can do otherwise. So there's not much harmonization. On the other hand, people cross borders. So there's a huge global reproductive travel where people, for instance, there are countries, as I understand, in France, up until recently at least, gay couples couldn't get treatment, but they could in Belgium, so they all go to Belgium to get treatment. And even in India for a number of years, it was a large industry of women serving as gestational surrogates, where they would carry in their womb children or fetuses for other couples. There were a lot of questions about that. India's then made, as I understand it, that could only be for Indian couples. Nepal had an industry for a while, and then there was concern when a Nepalese woman, as I understand it, found out she was carrying a child for a gay couple in Western Europe. She didn't approve of that, and so there were problems, as I understand, in Ukraine at the moment, or at least up until recent issues with Ukraine. But in recent years, there are a lot of Ukrainian women who are willing to be gestational surrogates, and again, they get thousands of dollars, and they've already been a mother rather. They're used to pregnancy or familiar with it. But again, this raises ethical questions. Are we exploiting people? There have been concerns about sex trafficking in New York under our former Governor Cuomo. He allowed for paid gestational surrogacy in New York. And there were Gloria Steinem, a noted feminist, argued that there would be sex trafficking of women who would be brought into New York to serve this purpose. Many of us suggest that there be a limit, that there be a certain amount of time a woman first needed to be living in New York State, but that didn't, to try to prevent that to some degree, but that did not end up making it into the final budget that Governor Cuomo passed, making it legal. Anyway, so with PGD, providers again vary in whether they know what they're doing. Again, there are rare diseases that are associated with genes. A lot of doctors, IVF doctors, don't know much about them. There's also non-disclosing pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which a lot of parents say, look, I'm at risk of Huntington's, or I don't want to know if I have Huntington's, but I just want to make sure that the gene, if I have it, isn't passed on to my children. But then sometimes it's quite clear the person has the disease, and doctors are left wondering, should I be bringing a child to this family, given that the parent has a terrible disease? Should I be judging the quality of the parents? And again, this gets into more detail. We can talk more about this in Q&A if people want. As I mentioned, it can be very expensive. They also save your siblings, which is there are children who have a rare disease where they need a regular blood transfusion or bone marrow transplant. And so IVF doctors and parents will create a child who is a match immunologically so that new child can donate bone marrow to the existing child, or sometimes with a parent. The parent may need a bone marrow donor, so the parent will create a child who can be a bone marrow donor for that parent. And again, a problem is the child has no say in it. And there's very little research done in this area, so we don't know. We need to know, how do children feel about that? Do they feel, gee, I'm glad I could save my sister's life, or do they feel this is terrible, I'm being stuck with needles all the time to help someone else? Again, choosing embryos for social reasons is a problem. In the United States, there are clinics that do a lot of work just giving people male children. People from certain cultures feel I want a male, I want a boy, carry on my name. Again, this is allowed. There are questions. There have been deaf parents who have said, I want a deaf child. There are dwarf parents who say, I want a dwarf child. And again, I think unborn children have a certain right. I think this is problematic. Children may not want to be deaf or dwarf. I mean, I have nothing against, deaf people and dwarf people live full, productive lives, but a child may or may not, given a choice, say, yes, I want to be deaf or dwarf. And again, the rights of that child are an issue. We also have a lot of couples are creating twins, have 2 kids, rather than having 2 pregnancies, have 1 pregnancy, and yet 45% of twins have medical problems. They never leave the hospital. They end up in the neonatal intensive care unit. And there are a lot of questions about that. Renting wombs, I mentioned, so-called gestational surrogacy was legal in California until recently, has now spread to New York. There's some additional interventions that IVF doctors do that could lead to where they're injecting sperm right into the egg, but it turns out it's used for 2/3 of IVF, but it turns out it increases risks of cognitive deficits. The questions are, what are good enough parents? There are religious issues that come up often, people feeling, gee, God must not have meant for me to have a child, or people being told by their friends, gee, I guess God didn't mean for you to have a child. What does that mean, etc. How much is a child worth? How much should you spend on this? Couples often disagree. Some couples empty out their life savings to have a child. Often the man said, men have told me, who I've interviewed, gee, my wife wants me to sell my motorcycle so she can have a baby. That's too much for me. So again, couples may vary in this. So basically, new technologies are creating new families. They could avoid certain diseases. They're also changing our species, and they raise a number of ethical issues, the rights of the unborn child, larger social issues. There are questions that vary how they're responded to across our different countries in terms of how much choice parents should have, who should be paying, who has rights to treatment. Should we oversee the industry more? Should government get involved? If so, how much? Should guidelines mandate that certain genes always be looked for, not looked for? There's needs for policy in the United States, professional associations, the AMA, the American College of Genetic Counselors, the federal government, the FDA, the CDC, states, insurance companies, clinics have by and large not paid much attention to this, but I think need to think about them. I think in the United States, the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, the CDC, collects data from clinics on what they're doing, but it's voluntary. So the CDC says to clinics, let us know how much IVF you're doing and what you're doing. And clinics can say, no, I don't want to give you my data. And the amount of non-reporting is going up. I think data should be mandatory to be reported in the United States, so we know. The concerns about exploitation of gestational surrogates, as I said, I think there are guidelines from the professional association, but they're not always followed. I think we should have registries to follow to make sure how often we're using sperm donors, et cetera, so people can find out if they were, et cetera. And clinics have not until recently had to keep records. I think there should be more regulation of agencies, donors, sperm donors. We need to sort of track this more, avoid potential exploitation, be careful in the interventions that doctors are using. I think profit motive is a major motive here for a lot of what IVF doctors do, and I think we should clean that up. And as I mentioned, there are these new technologies for altering the genes in embryos, and I think the fact that even with IVF right now, the industry's poorly regulated, doesn't bode well for our ability to oversee gene editing. In other words, when there'll soon be clinics that will say, even though it's not scientifically shown to be completely possible, I can increase the IQ of your future children. Give me $50,000 and I'll increase the kid's IQ. Again, this is going to be done before the science is ready. And of course, intelligence, it turns out, is 50% genetic, but there's probably dozens or hundreds of genes involved. And to be able to alter that is very difficult, but I think that won't stop the hype. I think there's more need for research and education among educated people like yourselves. I want to thank my funders. That's the book, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that very interesting and riveting presentation. You've thrown up so many interesting issues and implications of using technology. I'm going to start off the Q&A with a question, but I just wanted to tell everyone that as usual, you can ask questions. And if you want to ask questions, please indicate your name in the chat box, and I will call you as your name appears in the box. I already see several people ready to ask questions. So, but before that, can I ask you, maybe for those who are not aware, what is CRISPR technology?
Yes,
very briefly.
Yes, thank you. CRISPR stands for a clustered, it's intermittent repeats. In other words, what happens is, you know that, but it turns out it was discovered that in yogurt, for instance, that viruses don't affect yogurt. Yogurt is made of bacteria, but the bacteria had this unique ability that if a virus came and tried to inject its DNA to get reproduced into the bacteria in yogurt were able to clip it out. And it was a repeat. In other words, the DNA forms sort of a, how should I call it, a scissors. It was able to sort of cut out, so to speak, the DNA that it didn't want. And so we've now been able to apply this to other species. And the Nobel Prize was given to, in medicine 2 years ago, to Jennifer Doudna at Berkeley, who was one of the prime people who worked on this and discovered it. So it's the, as I said, clustered, random, interspersed repeats of the DNA. The DNA folds over itself, forming like a little scissors that can cut out other bits of DNA.
Right.
We can program. We can say, cut out this bit, cut out that bit. This is now here's the bit we want you to cut out.
Sure. Thank you for that. We have Betty Robbins, who indicated she has a question, and I think I saw Amabel James as well. So Betty first, and then Ami James.
Well, I'm going to start by thanking you, Zarina, and everyone at WIF for this program, and Dr. Klitzman. It's been just terrific. And I have a question now, because you've gone through so many different ethical issues, but you are a practicing doctor and a psychiatrist. And can you give us a sense of what you feel are the most taxing or challenging ethical issues that have walked into your office, and how you worked with your patients to resolve them?
Yeah. So I think that, so I as a psychiatrist don't see this that much, but I've interviewed a lot of doctors. So I think, to clarify, and thank you, it's a very good question. Some of these are what's going to happen in the future we need to be prepared for, and some what's happening now. Mm-hmm. I think one ethical issue is cost. So in other words, for us as a society, this is very expensive, and should we cover more of it? Should insurance cover more of it? So people, particularly women with infertility, say, I have infertility. That's no different than having diabetes or heart disease. I feel my insurance should cover it. Insurance says, we can't. This is being infertile. Yes, it's terrible. We can only give you $1,000 or $3,000. So I think a major question we all face is, should this be covered? Should this just be for wealthy people? So I think socially, that's a major issue. I think that another issue is going to be use of this technology for not medical reasons, but social reasons. So someone says, right now, if someone says, I just want a boy, we give them a boy. And I think that is raises questions. It's one, I think it's okay to use these technologies for medical problems, saying I want to get rid of the breast cancer gene or whatever, or cystic fibrosis, even though there are questions about cost. But saying I just want a boy, or I want a screen, we're soon going to be developing, or we have genes or genetic tests associated with height and intelligence and eye color and hair color. I think that gets into very murky territory. So I'd say those are some of the biggest issues that come up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ami, can you unmute yet?
Yes, there
Thank
I am
you.
unmuted. So what I'm wondering is, apart from the age issues, is fertility increasing? I've heard that the use of plastics has brought fertility issues. I have no idea if that's got any basis in anything real.
So yes, so there's increasing fertility among both men and women, whether it's plastics or pollution or the diet or who knows what, that is the case. I'm not sure how much it is. In other words, it's already 10%. So it's not increasing to 20%. So maybe it's increasing 0.5%, 1%. So it's definitely creeping up. And we need to be concerned about these. But even without the sort of harms of modern technologies and plastics, it's already, as I said, 20% of all heterosexual couples, 10% of men, 10% of women. And we don't know the reasons why it's otherwise sort of creeping up in society. You know, it's similar, is autism increasing? Is cancer increasing? I mean, there's, potential, in the case of cancer, carcinogens, but right. I should say what's interesting is, of course, that one of the arguments made by anti-vaxxers in anti-vax communities is that the vaccines for COVID cause infertility, which it definitely does not. But I think the fact that people are sort of, somehow causes infertility is not a bugaboo, but is of concern in society.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Amy, for the question. We have Hala and then followed by Arlene.
Yes, thank you very much. Wow, very interesting topic. Thank you. Doctor, one of the issues that I think about when I think of all the infertility and selling the donors, selling their eggs or selling sperms and that amount. Has there an issue come across, whether in the United States or worldwide, that siblings or half siblings, they don't know they have similar genes and they grow up and then they meet, or they have some relationship, or they think of getting married and they find out that they are half siblings, or they have similar genes.
Right. Yeah. So that's why I raced over some of the things in the end just to leave time for Q&A. But that's why I think there is a need for registry. So right now, if you were created through a sperm donor, egg donor in the United States, nobody knows. Your parents know, but no one keeps a record of, gee, I use this sperm donor to create 50 people in this little town, or 10 people in this town. And there's a need for that. Interestingly, by the way, other countries have changed. So Ireland, about 3 years ago, said that on all birth certificates, it would be listed if the child was created by an egg donor or sperm donor and who the person is. In this country, we still have anonymous donation where it's not known who the person is. We keep no record of, if I donate and create kids, there's no record anywhere of who I am. In Ireland and I'd say in the United Kingdom, around 8 years ago in the United Kingdom, it was said there can no longer be anonymous sperm donation, that if you do donate, my name's going to be listed somewhere. So countries vary even within the European Union about this and what they're doing. So this is a concern. That's why I think there's a need to track. So it wasn't until 3 years ago that the ASRM said, the American Doctor Association of IVF doctors said that clinics ideally should keep records, but it's still, if they don't want to, they don't. But it's to avoid that. And I should say there's also clinics in California that create whole embryos. So they'll get blonde-haired, blue-eyed women and donate their eggs. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed men donate their sperm. They'll create the embryos and they'll sell the embryos. And they're not half siblings; they're full siblings. So these people who are, same parent, same mother, same father, and no one's keeping records. Well, I created these 10 people or whatever. So I think, and there's no limit. I can create a whole city of these people if I wanted.
Yes, thank you. So I would assume this is a problem because if we don't know, and let's say they get married and they want to breed, that's a risk for children. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I think there needs to be more government involvement and oversight. And I should say I go into all these issues in much, much more detail and with vivid stories in the book, etc.
Thank you for that. So basically you're saying there's no regulation in place.
Right.
Right. We have Arlene and then Tina. Arlene first.
Thank you, Zarina. Am I on there?
Yes, you are. You are.
Oh, okay. Sorry. My question is about that. I mean, is there something in the works or that exists to create more guidelines and regulation among experts like yourself or government or people to talk about the ethical issues and make more regulations for the future instead of letting it continue so loosely?
Well, so the one area where there has been a push has been with CRISPR creating new babies. So in response to what the Dr. He Jiankui in China did, the WHO and the National Academy of Science and the British Royal Society came with guidelines about that. Now, mind you, for that, there've only been 3 or 4 kids so far created in the world using CRISPR. So they're looking toward the future. But for IVF, which is creating, millions of people every year, there's, at least in the United States, there is very little. Some of us have been pushing for it. And that's why I think getting the word out, there's not much traction. I mean, one is there's no, infertile couples are often ashamed of being infertile. And so they're not a sort of constituency. The industry is making billions and billions of dollars. I mean, I should add, the industry is rapidly being bought up by venture capital companies because people will literally empty out their whole bank accounts to have a child. And understandably, for some people, having a child, and I'm sure you all, this may describe some of you or people they're very successful people who I know who say, yes, I have a successful career. I'm president of a foundation or, professor at a major university. But the thing that's most important in my life is having had kids, right? So, and we wouldn't be here as a species if having children wasn't an important drive biologically, but psychologically and culturally and socially. So venture capital companies are buying up these companies, and it's estimated they're now at $5 billion. The industry is in the U.S. and 5 years it'll be 10 billion, then 15 billion. So that's where, and they don't want to be regulated. And at the same time, I think in the United States, at least politically, there's concern that if Congress got involved in this at the moment, for instance, given that there is a strong pro-life movement, that they may be focusing on the wrong thing. So there have been, for instance, the pro-lifers in many states have pushed for legislation about embryos, that you can't destroy embryos. So if a couple says, well, I created 8 embryos and we use 3 and we have 5 left over, I'd like to donate, just get rid of them because they're my biological kids. In some states, you can't do that. In other words, in some states, the state law is an embryo is a person and you can't destroy it. So again, given the political climate, it's difficult.
Thank you.
But I think increasing awareness of this is extremely, extremely important as a first step.
Thank you. Tina, your turn.
Thank you. Dr. Klitzman, you answered one of my questions. I was reading your opinion article that you wrote on Dr. He Jiankui's CRISPR twin girl. And I think you also said earlier that this is going to progress much faster than science will be able to research. It's so you answered my question. My question on Dr. He was he regulated? But you said there's very little. I imagine different countries have different regulations, if at all there are any. I was going to say it's so subjective. I myself, I'm sitting here thinking, and I'm thinking of a former colleague of ours who had breast cancer at a very young age, and other women who I know who had cancer at a very young age and freeze their eggs because of the chemotherapy that's going to destroy. That compared to Google and Facebook paying employees, you know, as I said, it's so subjective. I don't know how regulations are going to come about that are going to be global, or even just look at COVID restrictions or COVID things happening in the states, each state. I mean, I don't know. I will ask your opinion on that. And I have a question from a colleague, a WIF colleague, who is asking a question about gene splicing. And she says, in your opinion, in the balance of things, are there more benefits or drawbacks for gene splicing? And I think she was specifically speaking about creating through gene splicing these drugs, a human insulin, for example. And then, as you mentioned before, about genetic babies, the Nazi effect.
Right. So yeah. So a few things. So one, in the case of female employees at Google or Facebook, I think ethically informed consent is important. So young women, I'm not saying no, Google shouldn't offer this and women shouldn't say yes, but women should understand that it's not 100% foolproof guarantee. I don't need to worry about this. In other words, it's like saying, well, I have I'm wearing a seatbelt, so I don't have to worry about getting in a car accident. Yes, you wear a seatbelt, that's important, but you still may get in a car accident. So what you should realize, women should realize, yes, it's great they're able to freeze eggs, that should work out. The freezer can break, the eggs might not be good. You may have saved 5 eggs, they don't work. So, it's, there's uncertainty about it. I think a problem is that if women think, gee, I don't need to worry about this, it's taken care of, it's like saying, before the Great Depression, well, I have money in the bank, I don't have to worry about anything. Well, yes, you have money in the bank, that's great, but just, go with your eyes wide open, I would say. In the case of CRISPR and gene editing, gene splicing, what I didn't talk about is there are 2 sets of uses for that. One is to create new people, embryos. The other is in adults. So there's also gene therapy for adults. So there, in other words, if I'm have cancer, or if I'm missing a certain enzyme, it's possible to send in the, through gene therapy, take up the shell of a virus that can go inside me and puts a good gene in that I need. We allow that because it doesn't affect it. I could say, yes, I realize, like, anytime you take a drug or anytime you undergo serious surgery, they'll tell you, there's a certain % chance you may die, or there may be side effects, et cetera. And yes, there's a 60% chance I'll get better, 20% chance I may get sicker. I'll take those odds. So I'm able to make an informed choice. In the case of with embryos, there's really no clear benefit, because we can already, if it's a disease, we can already choose embryos. We can, people can use a donor egg or embryo or donor sperm. But also we could say, if I'm worried about breast cancer, it's not every, if I, create 8 embryos, they're not all, if I have the gene for breast cancer, they're not all going to have the gene for breast cancer. Some will, some don't. Like if you have kids, not all kids have the same genes, right? So we're able now to screen embryos, so we don't need to go in and muck up with the gene editing. And the problem with the gene editing, I should clarify, is one, the technology isn't good enough yet. So with Dr. Hye-Jong Kwei, he thought he would take out this amount of gene. He took out that amount of gene. So he took out too much. Secondly, genes do many things. So what he did is he worked with fathers who had HIV and took out the gene that lets HIV go into cells, a CCR5 gene, so the kids wouldn't get HIV. The problem is, if you take out that gene, prevents HIV getting in, but if you take that out, there's an increased likelihood of other viruses getting it. So there's increased likelihood of influenza getting in, or West Nile virus getting in. And the father could just take HIV medications and not pass on the disease, and we can clear out HIV virus from the sperm, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't necessary. So my concern is that money is driving this. He basically said he wants to open up an offshore clinic to give IQ points to babies and charge and earn millions and millions of dollars. And so there's a lot of hype. And that's the problem, is that it's, people, yes, extra IQ points for my baby, people would pay a lot of that. The science isn't there. And so the concern is that, in the meantime, genes served up other function. Let's say, yes, even the CCR5, it may be involved with kidney function or heart function, not just HIV. So there's too many unknowns.
Thank you so much for that. Do you have time for more questions?
We'll take a few more. How about a few more minutes and then.
Okay. All right. So we had Elena, who had said she wanted to ask a question. After that, followed by Andrea.
The question I was asking the doctor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I worked for 15 years with my husband, who was an infertility specialist. He was not doing IVF. He did everything before. And I must say that we saw a lot of patients, the majority of them, the problem was an infection given by the husband to the wife. So my point is that, as you say, is really money driven, because we have patients coming with 10 miscarriages, 3 IVF. If you have an infection, do IVF, you get a miscarriage. So if you don't cure the infection before, it's completely useful. But what I've seen, patients are sent to IVF as soon as they cannot conceive. Why they should try something else before if the doctor knows what to do? And that's my point, is it's a waste of money, it's a waste of time, and this patient had miscarriages, the money they spent, so it's money driven. I know there are moments and cases where you have to do IVF, but it's really, it's a business. It's
Right.
It's useful because it has to be done sometimes, there is nothing else, but in the majority of cases, something else could be done. And they don't teach it in medical school.
Yeah, so yes, I agree. I would say the only thing I'm not sure what percent, you say it's most cases of IVF aren't necessary.
Well, in our practice, it was 90%.
Yeah, at this point,
because the infection is silent.
Yes,
so
yes.
If you don't test it, the husband has absolutely no symptoms. Sometimes the wife has symptoms.
Correct, yes, right.
Sometimes they don't. So that's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
So I think medical school, my husband is teaching in medical, but something should be done there, because of course the money is big. So
I agree completely. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And then last question from Nella.
Thank you, Zarina. Thank you, Dr. Klitzman. My name is Andrea. I would like to ask you, you partially already answered the question about the unused frozen embryos, like the ethic of this issue and how long basically we can keep them, or what's going to happen with them in the future.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So what happens is couples will create a certain number of embryos, or many couples, like they create 8, they use say 2 and they have 6 left over. Clinics used to say, well, okay, couples will say, well, don't throw them out. We may need them if you could store them for us. And the clinic will say, that's fine. It's going to cost, let's say $500 a year, $1,000 a year, whatever it is to store them. And the couple stops paying. And the clinic then wonders, well, do we throw them out? So, and this is what happens. Most couples, they're ambivalent, right? Because this is potentially their future children. So they don't want to throw them out, but they don't want to pay for them, forever. And so clinics now sort of build that into the fee, but we have, millions of embryos stored. And because we have this ambivalence, and I think also it's because, many of us, there are those who feel an embryo is the same rights as a person. Many of us feel, well, no, the embryo is not equal to a person, but still has a certain moral status. It's not like, the dirt on your shoes, So, a colleague of mine says, if you ask people, well, would you feed embryos to your dog, human embryos? People say, well, of course not, right? So they have a certain degree of respect that, they're not it's like a deceased person. They're not a live living person, but we owe them respect. We're going to bury them. We're not just going to put them in the garbage heap, right? So So, deciding what that means in everyday practice is hard. An issue I think that's a problem is, as I mentioned, there are conservative states in the United States that say no, embryos can never be thrown away. Some couples donate embryos to research, which is not allowed in all states, but in some states and countries, which I think is another potential good use. There were cases where one couple had a certain number of embryos left, and they had friends who were infertile. And they said, you can use our embryos. So they made 8, they used 2, they had 6 left over, they gave them to their friends. Their friends used 2, had 4 left over. The friends then gave them to another set of friends. And the first couple said, you had no right to give those embryos to your friends. I don't like those people. These are our biological kids. I don't want you raising our biological kids. So a lot of this challenges notions of property that we have, right? So if I give you, a box of cookies, I have a box of cookies and I eat 2 and I give you the box and you eat 2 and you give them to your friends, I don't care who you give the leftover cookies to. If it's embryos who are my biological kids, that has cultural meaning, psychological meaning. And so the problem is that legally our notions of property are based on land. Like if I have this piece of land, I can give you the land, you can buy it and sell it. But when it comes to human DNA, it's a much more complicated set of issues that our laws have generally not been able to think through yet.
Thank you. So one last question from Nella. Can you unmute, please, Nella?
Could there be a guideline from the World Health Organization about what the genes of diseases will prevent somebody from being an egg or sperm donors? What diseases will be number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 for both eggs and sperm donors?
Yes. So it's a great question. I agree with you that WHO can get more involved in this. WHO, as you know, has been underfunded. I mean, one problem I should say is that if how much of this is important for many of us, right? And so for 20% of people, 20% plus, as we've been talking, we're infertile. But for many countries, this is not the national health problem, right? I mean, when it's COVID or there's, malaria or tuberculosis. So for a lot of it's not, for many countries, it's not the top priority of if we have limited resources and attention. I agree with you. I think it would be great for WHO to get more involved, and it's a great idea for them to think about what diseases. In the United States, the feeling is it's a commercial marketplace. You can decide anything you want screened out, we'll screen it out. You want Alzheimer's screened out, we'll screen it out. Other countries where the United Kingdom, which pays for IVF, in other words, countries that have national health insurance where the government's paying, are much more careful. So the United Kingdom says, this is the list certainly for what we can screen embryos for. So it varies on, there's also risk-benefit ratio of if they're really rare diseases, and also not all diseases have strong genetics. So this is a complicated area, but I think having WHO get involved would be very helpful.
Thank you so much. I think, Nella, you are muted.
Do you think that the United Nations as an organization can help in bringing the WHO to make it a rule to eliminate donors of diseases 1, 2, 3, 4 to be used for IVF, for instance?
So I think it would be great to have the UN, have WHO look at these issues more than they've done. Absolutely. To have UN get involved, to have WHO do something would be important. It gets complicated with which diseases. So breast cancer, for instance, if I have the breast cancer gene, there's a 50% chance I may get breast cancer, 50% chance I won't. So just because I have the gene, just because an embryo even has the gene, doesn't mean that the person will get breast cancer. And breast cancer doesn't affect people until they're usually late 30s, 40s, 50s. By then there may be treatment. So a lot depends on how much expense a country wants or a person wants to spend to eliminate certain diseases. So these are the calculations. But I think to get the UN involved, to have WHO look at these issues and think about these issues and think what can be done would be extremely helpful.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the response, Robert. You've overshot your time, so I thank you very much for staying with us and giving us so many food for thought. I mean, the issues that you've raised, a lot of positives and potentials in technology, but there's a lot of pitfalls and a lot of regulations need to be in place as well. So if members of WIF and today's audience are interested in reading up on this issue, I will send a link to Robert's book in an email later on, together with the recording of today's event. So once again, on behalf of the Women's International Forum, thank you, Robert, for joining us.